It's been obviously fantastic, and she's been a little joy of heaven. But at the same time, it is more responsibility looking after two little ones.
Princess Charlotte stood in front of Prince William and told him she missed him, and the whole royal family froze. The Christmas party was full of lights, food, and laughter, but Charlotte's small voice stopped it all. No one laughed after that. Everyone stared as William looked like he forgot how to breathe. Tune in, because Charlotte's words hit harder than any royal rule ever could. A Christmas like no other. The halls of Sandringham were filled with a warmth that seemed almost alive. Crackling fires cast dancing shadows along the old stone walls, laughter bounced freely between heavy velvet curtains, and the faint smell of pine needles and cinnamon floated lazily through the corridors. This was the kind of Christmas gathering most families only dream about, woven with traditions older than memory itself. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasts glistening with juices, towering puddings steaming in silver bowls, and platters of sweets stacked like treasures. Children raced through the drawing rooms, shrieking with glee, their footsteps a living heartbeat in the ancient house. But something was already slipping out of place. Yet beneath the glow and music, the royal family carried something heavier than the season's cheer, the ever-present weight of duty. It clung to them like a second skin, invisible but inescapable, even on holidays. Public appearances, endless photographs, ceremonial obligations, each tradition polished and perfected over centuries. Even laughter, even joy had its place and timing. Every move, every smile carried the silent pressure of history. In the center of this gilded world stood Prince William, tall, composed, every inch the air his country needed. Yet behind the polished smile was a man trying to bridge the impossible, the father his children needed and the leader his nation expected. His days blurred into a churn of meetings, briefings, and ceremonial events, each more urgent than the last. And in the blur, the years slipped by. His children, growing faster than he could grasp, often became mere glimpses, a hand waving goodbye through a car window, a sketch in a report from security. This Christmas was supposed to be different, a chance to freeze time, to be a family without cameras lurking behind the drapes or expectations tightening like strings around their hearts. Just moments, unscripted, unmeasured, precious. For a while, it worked. Charlotte, 9 years old and bursting with life, moved through the crowded room like a sunbeam. She tied ribbons around napkins with elaborate bows, teased her brothers with exaggerated curtsies, and giggled at the clumsily wrapped gifts stacked beneath the towering tree. Her laughter floated through the air, pure and contagious. Around her, the family loosened, laughter growing louder, embraces lasting a beat longer. For a moment, it felt like a real home, until it didn't. It happened in the quiet between conversations when the room had settled into a gentle hum. Charlotte paused. A tiny stillness, almost imperceptible, but in a family accustomed to watching for signs, it was enough. She walked with deliberate steps across the drawing room, threading her way between chairs and chattering adults, and stopped before her father. She looked up at him, her face calm but serious, and delivered her message with a soft precision that shattered the room's cozy illusion. She told him, simply without tears or theatrics, that she missed him. Not the prince, not the public figure, her father. The words were quiet, but they landed like thunder. Around them, conversation slowed, then stumbled. Eyes turned, subtly but surely. Yet no one intervened. No one dared. The weight of the moment was too sacred. William froze. The carefully constructed world around him, titles, duty, ceremony, shuddered under the impact of his daughter's truth. It was not an accusation. It was not a plea. It was a simple, unfiltered statement of need, pure as winter snow. In that suspended moment, Charlotte achieved what no audience, no accolade, no historic duty could. She forced the future King of England to see himself not through the eyes of tradition, but through the eyes of his own child. Kate, sitting nearby, turned toward them. Her eyes widened, not with embarrassment or horror, but with a fierce kind of pride. She had always known Charlotte was brave, clever beyond her years. But this was something rarer. This was courage wrapped in love, honesty unshielded by fear. No one spoke. The fire crackled, the old walls held their breath, and time seemed to fold inward. In the heavy silence, William's mask, polished by years of expectation, slipped. For one aching heartbeat, he was not His Royal Highness. He was not the Duke. He was not the heir. He was just a man, a father who had missed too many small moments, a man who had let the roar of duty drown out the tiny, vital voices of home. Charlotte's words didn't just fall to the floor. They echoed, growing louder with every beat of William's heart. They peeled away the layers of distance that had crept in, unnoticed, between him and the ones he loved most. This wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about love, the oldest, simplest kind, the need to be seen, to be heard, to matter. And so, in a room lined with centuries of power and tradition, the real story of that Christmas unfolded. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in a single, fragile moment of connection. Charlotte didn't need to repeat herself. Her words had done their work. The air shifted, subtly but unmistakably. William's smile came a little easier now. His hands lingered a little longer on his children's shoulders. His glances toward Kate softened into something warmer, deeper. The ripple Charlotte set in motion traveled quietly through the holiday. No announcements were made, no headlines proclaimed it, but something had changed, deep and lasting. And at the heart of it was a 9-year-old princess who understood more clearly than most adults what truly mattered. Behind every staged family portrait, behind every ceremonial march, behind every polished speech and smiling wave, there was a family that needed, like all families, to stop, to look, to listen. And it took Charlotte, with her small voice and enormous heart, to remind them. As the fire burned lower and the first flakes of Christmas snow drifted against the windows, something even stronger than tradition took root at Sandringham. But love was not the only thing stirring that night just beyond the reach of the firelight. The moment that changed everything. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Sandringham shifted in ways too delicate to catch on camera, but too powerful to miss for those who lived it. There were no grand speeches, no sweeping promises shouted from the rooftops. But there was something different in the air, something warmer, slower, more real, wrapping itself around the old halls and everyone within them. William began to move differently. The constant urgency that usually pulled at his every step softened. He sat a little longer after meals, his hand resting easily on Charlotte's shoulder, his laughter coming quicker and brighter when George cracked a joke, his head bending lower when Louis whispered secret plans about snowball fights into his ear. The invisible wall, the one constructed from expectations, schedules, and the unrelenting march toward the crown, had cracked, and through that slender, fragile break, something precious began to seep back in. It wasn't that William hadn't loved his children before. Of course he had. It was simply that love in the royal world had to compete with 1,000 other obligations. Love that rushed through bedtime stories read hastily before late-night briefings. Love that promised tomorrow again and again because today was always too full, too spoken for. Love that often meant watching the clock more closely than the child before him. Charlotte's quiet courage had shattered that rhythm. She had reminded him, with 9-year-old honesty and unshakable clarity, that love needed more than good intentions and empty promises. It needed presence. It was needed today, not tomorrow. It needed being there, fully, without distraction, when it mattered most. The royal Christmas festivities rolled on. Church services, formal dinners, the expected appearances. Tradition marched forward, proud and polished. But tucked between the ceremonies were small, glorious rebellions. William scooped Charlotte up into a hug so sudden it made her squeal with laughter. Kate and William exchanging glances across crowded rooms, silent conversations filled with love and knowing. George's face lit up as William ruffled his hair with genuine affection, not just for the cameras, but for the boy standing in front of him. And Charlotte, always Charlotte, weaving her way through it all with her quiet, glowing strength, leaving warmth in her wake, like a candle carried through darkened halls. She didn't bring up her Christmas message again. She didn't need to. She had delivered it perfectly the first time, an arrow shot straight and true. It had pierced not just William's armor, but the invisible distance that duty had wrapped around all of them. Charlotte's bravery wasn't the kind that shouted over the noise of the world. It was the kind that stood still against the current and held its ground. It was the bravery of honesty, of clarity, of speaking the small, quiet truths that often matter more than the loud proclamations. It was the courage to choose connection over tradition, heart over protocol. Not everyone in the royal circle knew about the moment that had unfolded that night. Only a handful had witnessed it firsthand, and fewer still understood its weight. But for those who had seen, it became a quiet legend, a whispered memory carried carefully through corridors older than time. A reminder that even in a family built upon centuries of tradition, real change could come from the youngest voice in the room. As the holiday days faded into velvet nights and slipped softly into the new year, Charlotte's words did not fade with them. They stayed. They traveled with William back into the bright, cold rooms of briefings and meetings. They echoed softly as he fastened the uniforms of state over his shoulders. They whispered to him during long, rainy drives back to London when the windows blurred and the road stretched endlessly ahead. He remembered the way Charlotte had looked at him, steady, unafraid, full of trust. And he remembered what it felt like to be seen through her eyes, not as a prince, not as a leader, but simply as her father. The world outside the palace gates buzzed forward, oblivious to what had transpired. Headlines flashed by about royal charities, political feuds, far-off wars. Few realized that behind the polished royal narratives, something infinitely more important was taking place. Something quieter but deeper. Something that could never be captured by cameras or summarized in official statements. Not the kind spoken in front of witnesses, not the kind etched into stone. A promise made silently, sealed with a glance, a shared breath, a lingering touch. And somehow, without knowing the full magnitude of what she had done, Charlotte had given him that gift, entirely, without asking for anything in return, without demanding it. By the time the royal family returned to London, the public saw only what they were meant to see: the impeccable smiles, the perfectly timed photo ops, the handshakes and formalities. But within the walls of the palace, the real breathing heart of the monarchy, the change was as solid as the ancient stones themselves. William bent down more often to hear his children's secrets. He laughed louder and stayed longer at family dinners. His hands lingered protectively on small shoulders. His eyes softened when he looked at his wife, at his children, at the life that existed beyond the ceremonies. Charlotte had reminded them all, reminded the very heart of royalty, that behind every title, every tradition, every careful staging, there beat something older and stronger than crowns. And for a little girl who understood more than her years should have allowed, who dared to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent, that was enough. Even as Sandringham grew quiet and London took them back, a new storm was already forming far away. The night Princess Charlotte broke tradition. The story of that Christmas moment wasn't written in the official royal records. It didn't make the front pages of the papers or ignite debates among political pundits. It wasn't analyzed in endless columns or dissected by historians. But it echoed where it mattered most, in the private spaces of a family so often trapped beneath the harsh, unrelenting glare of 1,000 cameras. And at the very center of that quiet revolution stood Princess Charlotte. To understand the power behind her simple, world-shaking words, you have to understand where she came from. not the polished photographs that graced magazine covers or the carefully choreographed balcony appearances at Buckingham Palace. No, you have to look closer, past the surface, into the hidden corners of her life. The real life, the moments no one else got to see. Charlotte was born into a world already heavy with expectation. The bells of St. Mary's Hospital had barely stopped ringing when the world started speculating about her future. Would she be dutiful? Would she be rebellious? Would she be lost in the shadow of her older brother? Or would she carve out her own place in the ever-thickening story of the House of Windsor? Even her name was heavy with meaning. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana. Each syllable is a thread woven from legacy, memory, and deep love. A link in a chain stretching back across centuries of triumph, tragedy, and tradition. But William and Kate had a different plan for her, one that defied the silent currents of history tugging at their family. They wanted their daughter to have something no title, no ceremony, no privilege could buy: a real childhood. At Anmer Hall, tucked away from the city's noise and expectation, Charlotte learned how to climb trees before she learned how to curtsy. She splashed through muddy puddles long before she mastered the royal wave. She raced through gardens, tumbled over her brothers in gleeful wrestling matches, pulled faces when photographers got too close. She lived first, fully, messily, gloriously, before learning how to pose. She grew up real, not perfect, not polished, not curated, but entirely, stubbornly real. And in that rare and fragile space, half royal, half ordinary, Charlotte's spark was allowed to catch fire. By the time the family moved to Kensington Palace, Charlotte was already showing the world hints of who she was becoming. The public saw flickers of it at official events. The little girl sticking out her tongue during a boat race, the fierce glare she aimed at overeager photographers, the mischievous smiles exchanged with her brothers during long, tedious ceremonies. Every move she made, no matter how small, whispered the same defiant message: I will not be swallowed whole by this world. Yet, crucially, Charlotte never rejected her royal role. She didn't lash out against it. She didn't try to escape it. She didn't treat her duty as a burden or a battle to be fought at every turn. Instead, she reshaped it with grace and quiet strength. At Queen Elizabeth's funeral, standing solemn and composed beside her grieving family, Charlotte didn't look like a child lost in a sea of black. She looked like someone who understood, someone who carried the weight of tradition with a maturity far beyond her years. She bowed at the right moments, held herself with quiet dignity, and mourned openly yet respectfully, walking the tightrope between public ceremony and private loss with astonishing poise. In doing so, Charlotte showed the world a new kind of royal, one who could honor the past without being imprisoned by it, who could shoulder the weight without letting it crush her, who could embody history while still blazing her own distinct path through it. Charlotte's gift was not just her charm, her bravery, or even her quick wit. It was her authenticity, her refusal to let the rigid structures of her world mold her into something she was not. In a realm built almost entirely on image and ceremony, she remained stubbornly, gloriously herself. And in doing so, she wielded a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't need titles or declarations to change the course of things. The kind that could soften even the hardest hearts, that could remind a future king that his first, most sacred duty wasn't to a crown or a country, it was to the tiny hands reaching up for him at the end of a long day. The royal family didn't make a public statement about the Christmas moment. Of course they wouldn't. That wasn't how things were done. But inside the family, the effects rippled outward like a secret current, altering the landscape in ways no decree ever could. William, once consumed by the endless grind of duty, made more space for small things. A soccer game in the back garden, a bedtime story read slowly without glancing at a buzzing phone, a slow walk home from school filled with laughter and inside jokes. Kate, always the quiet architect of her children's emotional worlds, smiled more often in public, her eyes brighter, her posture a little more relaxed, the pride in her gaze no longer hidden but shining openly for all to see. Even George and Louis seemed to soak in the change, laughing louder, clinging a little tighter to their father's hand, moving with more ease within the royal spaces that had once seemed so cold and formal. And Charlotte herself blossomed, not because she had won a rebellion or toppled a tradition, but because she had spoken her truth, and perhaps even more remarkably, had been heard. It was a lesson too many adults never learned, a kind of wisdom that often seemed lost in the endless rush and noise of modern life. And Charlotte, at just 9 years old, had delivered it with more grace and power than most politicians, scholars, or leaders ever could. The press continued its chatter, speculating on royal feuds, spinning stories from fragments and whispers, distracted by the noise of politics and protocol. But in the quiet spaces where real history is made, something infinitely more important was unfolding. A little girl had reminded a family, and maybe even a nation, of what truly matters. Not tradition, not ceremony, not appearances, but love, connection, and presence. In doing so, she had accomplished something that even the grandest titles, the most enduring legacies, could never guarantee. She had made history, not through battles or decrees, but through the simple, radical act of being real. Quietly, completely, forever. But history, as the royal family would soon see, always asks more from those brave enough to change it. A future written in courage. As winter melted into spring, the royal family slipped back into their rhythm of appearances, tours, and unrelenting duties. The cameras returned, the crowds thickened, the world, ever watchful, waited for the next headline, the next scandal, the next perfect photo. But under the surface, something had shifted, something invisible to the public, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. And it was all because of a little girl who had dared to speak when no one else would. Charlotte moved through her world with a new lightness. She was not reckless, not rebellious, but simply and definitely real. She held her father's hand a little longer when stepping out of the car, laughed a little louder when the cameras clicked, and met the demands of her role without letting them erase the vibrant spirit within her. She didn't shrink away from the expectations draped over her like a royal cloak. She simply refused to let them weigh her down. The world began to notice. At public appearances, Charlotte didn't just attend, she arrived. There was confidence in the way she moved, the way she glanced at her brothers, the way she smiled up at the cheering crowds. It wasn't the polished, rehearsed poise of an adult royal who had spent a lifetime perfecting a public face. It was something fresher, braver, and infinitely more powerful. The quiet courage of a girl who knew her worth beyond titles and traditions. Charlotte wasn't hiding behind the trappings of royalty. She was walking right through them, head held high, her own quiet rebellion stitched into every curtsy, every smile, every wave. The old royal scripts had no space for girls like her, girls who felt deeply, who spoke plainly, who didn't wait for permission to matter. But Charlotte didn't seem concerned with fitting into any script. She was too busy writing her own. And with every tiny, fearless step, she was redrawing the map for what it meant to grow up royal in the 21st century. For William and Kate, the change was impossible to ignore. They had always hoped to raise children who could balance the ancient demands of royalty with the modern need for authenticity. But hope, fragile and fleeting, often bends under the weight of reality. Seeing Charlotte live that balance so naturally gave them more than hope. It gave them a blueprint. They began reshaping family routines to create more moments of presence. Meals without phones buzzing at the table. Walks without security trailing so close that the air grew heavy. Trips that ended not with formal greetings, but with messy, joyful dinners around the kitchen table. They didn't abandon duty. They couldn't. But they made more space around it, space for the small moments that Charlotte had fought for without even knowing she was fighting. And it mattered. It mattered in ways that would never make the news, would never be chronicled in official reports, but would define a future nonetheless. Because one day, William would wear the crown, and when that day came, he would carry with him, Not just the weight of history and expectation, but the memory of a Christmas evening when his daughter had reminded him what all the crowns, castles, and ceremonies were supposed to protect in. The first place, family, love, life. Not just for the public to see, but for the people who mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, when Charlotte grew older, when the pressures mounted and the glare of the world became too bright, she would remember too. She would remember that she had power, not the kind granted by birthright, but the deeper kind, the kind no one could ever take away. The kind that comes from speaking truth even when it trembles in your throat. The kind that can change a family, and maybe, if you're brave enough, change a future. Perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was that Charlotte didn't set out to be a symbol. She wasn't trying to lead a revolution. She wasn't trying to rewrite royal history. She was simply a daughter who missed her father, and sometimes the smallest truths are the ones that leave the biggest marks. As the royal family prepared for the next wave of official duties, tours, celebrations, ceremonies, they moved forward with new threads stitched quietly into their tapestry. Threads of laughter shared in secret corners, of time protected fiercely, of hearts opened just a little wider. Threads spun by a little girl who had looked up at the future king and seen not the crown, but the man, and loved him enough to say what needed saying. Charlotte's Christmas message didn't just shake Sandringham, it rippled outward, weaving itself into the very fabric of a family, a legacy, and perhaps even a nation. It whispered a truth that even centuries of royal tradition could not silence, that titles fade, that ceremonies blur, and that legacies are not written in marble halls or grand events, but in the soft, fierce truths spoken across warm rooms filled with love. One day, history books will chart the reigns of kings and queens, the wars fought and the treaties signed, the alliances forged and broken. But tucked inside those grand chapters, quiet and unshakable, will be the real story. The story of a little girl, a drawing room bathed in firelight, and a single, world-changing moment when a future king was reminded that the greatest duty of all is not to a throne, but to a family. And it all began with Charlotte, not with a royal decree, not with a grand event, but with a truth so simple, so pure, so powerful, that it needed no crown to make it matter. And long after the crowns have tarnished and the headlines have faded into dust, that moment will remain, unshakable, unforgettable, unbreakable. What if the real legacy of a royal family isn't written in ceremonies or captured in portraits, but whispered in the quiet courage of a 9-year-old girl who dared to speak her heart? Leave your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe for more.